Welcome everyone. My name is EJ Bryn and I'm the Associate Director of Stakeholder Engagement at BC Council for International Education. And I'm thrilled to welcome you to our webinar today called Internationalization and Indigenization, Tensions and Collaborations. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I live and work on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And it is my true honor to invite Elder Latash Lahaney to open this session off with a formal welcome. Over to you, Elder Latash.
Oh, here we go. Osium Tanoya, Tanoan Sayaman Siaya, Sayoyakwa, Clachid Nomen on Hot and Squalwin, Natha Uns Latash Quashamin, Tanalachan Asahano Hameo, Sko Omashot, No Chayatman Mahat, On Monoxton Squalwin. Greetings to all of you. I have a good feeling in my heart to be with all of you today, to welcome you to this webinar, to this gathering of minds. I want to share with you, CMs, that although the journey is difficult, it is always worthwhile to pursue the path less well traveled. I welcome you and respect you. I welcome you to the traditional territories of Coast Salish people. This land here where we are gathered has been walked upon by the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations for many, many years. And we have this big connection with the land, and I want to say that I like the idea that the maple leaf is on our flag here in Canada, because this area of Vancouver is called the land of maples. So it's actually quite fitting that, we have this thing in common, this love for our land and our place and our resources. We need to overcome things like the Indian Act and colonization. We need to follow the lead of UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. As the universities adopt the feelings, the intent of this UNDRIP, then the world will be a better place for all of us to live in. I want to share with you, my respected friends, I want to share with you that in 1957, my father talked to the principal of the residential school where his children were attending, and he told her of his dream of his daughters going to university. And he said that the principal was laughing so hard she fell out of her chair. And she ended up, when she got her breath, she said, I apologize, Mr. Nahaney, but we don't offer the curriculum at this institution for your daughters to even qualify to go to university. And my dad said that is going to change. And within a couple of years, they were going to public school. They got the courses and they qualified to go to university. So many, many victories have happened since then. And, in a way, it's a victory for First Nations people, but I believe it's a victory for all of us, because each of us, my dear relatives and friends, each of us have a gift. And the university's job is to nurture that gift, to bring that person along, and let's see what happens when that seed is planted and germinated. What fruit will it bear? And so today I hold my hands up to all of you to continue this work of reconciliation, and someday Indigenous people will be in the administration roles in the universities, perhaps even a president of the university. But that is up to us to make sure that there is good change that benefits all people. Osium, thank you for having me here with you today.
Thank you, Elder Latash. Thanks for sharing your stories again this morning and for the warm welcome, as I think it really is setting the foundation for the conversation we're about to embark on today during this session.
Thank you.
As people are logging in from all over the world, I want to extend my respect to the lands that all of you reside on as well, and welcome you to place your own land acknowledgements in the chat box as we continue. I would also like to take a moment to ask all of you to reflect on how you may personally and professionally create and foster stronger relationships with Indigenous peoples, the land you reside on, and all things living and non-living around you. So this webinar is part of our intercultural series that runs once a month through May. On a side note, we have decided to add in one more session on June 15th, which is entitled Dialogue Series Closing and an Opening, and is designed to provide an opportunity for you to reflect on your learnings over the last year and present ideas and opportunities for new learnings as you move forward in your personal development. We will put the link for the registration in the chat box, and the information will be posted shortly on our website. On that note, our past and upcoming webinars are all on our website as well, and we encourage you to view any sessions that you haven't seen already and to participate in our Certificate of Completion program. On to a few housekeeping items. Thank you for agreeing to our respectful workplace policy. Microphones have been muted for the duration of the session, and we'd have the chat box available as well as the Q&A function. Please put any Q&A questions in the Q&A box as we continue this session, and we will get to them at the designated Q&A time at the end as always. Finally, for accessibility, we are turning on the transcription mode. If you would like to turn this off, you can do so in the panel at the very bottom. Thank you for your cooperation with this. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Todd Odgers, the Associate Dean of International at BCIT, who will set the scene for this webinar and introduce our speakers for today. Todd, over to you.
Hello, everyone. And thank you very much, Elder Latash. As always, it's a pleasure to see you again and to have you open our sessions. And this is a session I've been looking forward to for some time. And we have, over the past number of months, looked at a wide range of topics and trends in international education and intercultural education, from creating more inclusive programming, more equitable workspaces, anti-racist approaches in our education system, ways that a critical and post-colonial perspective can inform our work. And I'm so delighted to have these two panelists here today to share their perspective. I'll start with Corey, a brief introduction of Corey, who is the executive, Corey Wilson is the executive director of Indigenous Initiatives and Partnerships at BCIT. She's currently the CICAN Chair of National Indigenous Education Committee. She's inaugural Chair of the World Federation of Colleges and Polytechnics Indigenous Affinity Group. She publishes, she teaches, she speaks widely on educational issues, learner success, and something I hope that you're going to talk a little bit about, Corey, reconciliation. I love that. It's super nice. And I hope, Corey, later you'll talk a little bit about that picture behind you, because I think that's a strong link to our topic today as well. The second are Sonia. Sonia Knudsen is Director of Internationalization Office, ESL Programs, and the Writing Center at Memorial. And when we were speaking with Elder Latash earlier, we talked, he said, oh, both coasts. So we're going coast to coast, sadly not coast to coast to coast today, but we got two of the three. Sonia has worked many years in internationalization and student affairs and at Memorial, and occupied a wide range of portfolios and roles and levels of responsibility. It's been a fascinating thing. I've known Sonia for a number of years to watch her career growing. And she's sat on CBIE's board. She's a past instructor at the Queen's IETP program. And what I'm really looking forward to hearing is how she'll talk about the direction of internationalization leadership and the importance of the TRC and how that thinking and ethos has influenced her recent work. And it's just a pleasure to have both of you here today. Welcome.
Thank you.
I guess one way of starting, maybe Corey, I'll start with you with a question, and then this is open. Please feel free to interact with each other on this. This is a session about internationalization and indigenization, and I'm wondering, why is it that you think we should be talking about this this topic here today?
Sorry, excuse me. I just want to acknowledge that I'm coming today from the Musqueam territory, and thank you, Elder Latash, for your opening. So why does it matter? I mean, I think reconciliation and indigenization matters across Canada. It should matter to every single Canadian, and it should matter to we're bringing in students and people from around the world. They're coming to the land that belongs to Indigenous people that have been here since the beginning of time. So it's just as it's important that every Canadian, everybody who comes to Canada and studies in Canada really needs to locate themselves in the appropriate place and space. The territory upon, they need to know whose land they're on, whose territory they're on, whose culture and traditions used to be there and hopefully are still there in the process of nation rebuilding. And also there's a natural affinity, I think, between international students and Indigenous people in many ways. In a lot of ways, the challenges that they face in the academy are the same. Obviously, they manifest in a little bit of a different way, but the needs and challenges are very similar. And the reality is we're bringing newcomers, and let's face it, many international students want to become citizens of Canada. And we need to have all citizens of Canada completely understand the truth about the history of Indigenous people, the history of Canada, and the legacy of colonization and oppression that has occurred, and that will make them better citizens. And to me, it's a no-brainer, right? And because that's how they come to Canada for its reputation, and we want to ensure that the lived experience of every Canadian lives up to that international reputation that Canada has.
Right. And earlier at one time we talked, and you said, so much of our lands and our work is on these lands, but so much of that work is not acknowledging or not working within the academy, that acknowledgement of the lands that we're on and the acknowledgement of that history, right?
Yeah, well, exactly. And the academy is a colonial system. The institutions that we have in this country have systemic racism and discrimination built into them. So we need to decolonize the academy to ensure that everybody's voice is respected and reflected and elevated and advocated for, including international students. We know that many, and we've seen with COVID, many of our institutions are very dependent and very tied to whether it's whatever it is that international students bring, which is mostly money in many cases. So if we're taking money from a group of people to help fund and offset costs that we have in our institutions, we owe it to them to give them, to help locate them in the appropriate place and space, provide them with all of the tools that they need to be successful. If we're talking about British Columbia, you can't do business in British Columbia without having a respect and understanding for Indigenous people in this province. And if we don't give it to international students in the academy while they're students, how are they going to go on and be successful in the province, in their business life, or whatever career they decide to go into?
Yeah, I remember at one time you said something about meeting a German student or a German person.
Yeah. Well, and that's exactly it, is you've got to dispel those false notions. They're Karl Heinz books or something like that. There's those books that have gone around at the time, Eastern Europe, and almost every single person, and that goes to my background. My background is of Pearson College, where I went to high school. It's an international a boarding school based on how can there be peace without understanding? How can there be understanding if people don't know each other? So Lester B. Pearson's Nobel Prize winning speech. And the number of students and people from Europe, particularly, who have read these books that give these false ideas of Indigenous people, not only in terms of the culture and it's more theatrical, our culture in the books, but also the idea that we're a dead culture. So we have all of these people, and it's not just, a lot of times people think, well, in Asia, of course, in China, they don't know about Indigenous people, but if they really do, there's Indigenous people in China, but it's people that particularly come from Europe that have read these books that really don't understand the connection. And so we've got our job, we have a responsibility to international students to provide them with the skills and abilities and tools that they need to be successful in Canada. And that includes a full, complete understanding of the history of Canada.
Thank you. Yeah. Sonia, do you want to sort of pick up there?
Absolutely, and thank you, Corey. First of all, I'm presenting to you today from Newfoundland and Labrador, and Memorial's campuses are across both territories of the island of Newfoundland and the mainland of Labrador. We have many diverse Indigenous nations here within our borders, and we acknowledge with respect the Beothuk, the Mi'kmaq, the Inuit, and the Innu of our province. I really loved what Elder Latash said in the introduction, the story that was related about the passion of his grandfather, I believe it was, for education, and the belief that if the children went to a school that, would provide them with the tools that they needed to be able to get into higher education, that would be the beginning place for change. I love that story because I see so many similarities between that story and the hopes and dreams of international parents around the world. That these parents place their trust in us, the colleges and universities of Canada and other countries. But these parents place their trust in us to prepare their students, like they sacrifice so much in order for their children to be able to join. And the sad part is that until we truly embrace reconciliation to our Indigenous peoples, but also to our vulnerable international students who are here without families, who are here on their own, that we're not doing good. We're supposed to be doing good, but we're not doing good until we actually embrace that. I've worked in international education for more than 20 years. I'm very much a believer in education as a way to improve understanding of different ways of knowing and being that are global. And so, I come at internationalization from that perspective, but until I really began learning about indigenization from my colleagues at my university here, I didn't realize how colonial my approach was and how colonial international education is. I have a quick story I'll share with you. I became friends with a colleague who was the lead of our Indigenous office around 2012 or so. And we were talking about, is there a way that we could do cross-cultural training together? We're both doing cross-cultural training. So I was like, well, what do you do when you teach cross-cultural training? And I was sharing what I do when I teach cross-cultural training. And I shared, we use different questionnaires and tools and things like that. And I saw a sort of growing horror on her face. And she said, but how did the international students help you to pick the tools that you use when you do, cross-cultural training? And I said, well, I didn't ask the international students. They don't know anything about this field. And her face was just aghast. And she said, but I would never, ever do cross-cultural training without speaking to my community, without speaking to, Indigenous students. And I said, well, I have like international students that I bring on to panels, but I had noticed that when international students were on panels, that they tended to be very congratulatory or very positive about their experiences. It seemed like they didn't like to share, or it wasn't a safe space, I guess is what I could say. And I noticed that. So I have to say that for internationalization, there is so much that we can and need to learn about indigenization, about reconciliation, about what our role is and should be with these students that are being entrusted to our care.
Corey, I see you nodding. Did you want to say something in response to that? I'm going to come back to you, Sonia, but I saw you nodding. It's like,
Well, I just think it's so, for me, it's so intuitive. You don't speak about others or to others with an expertise that you haven't lived or you haven't asked about. It's just you speak about what you know, and if you want to speak about something else, you have to build relationships, building engagement, authentic connections, and ask permission to speak about another person's experience. So I think it's a great epiphany, and I'm glad you've had it, Sonia. And if we all did that, I think it would, we'd get on much better.
Sonia, earlier at one point we were talking about all of the great researchers and writers and people that publish about internationalization, DeWitt, Knight, and all these others that talk about this process orientation of internationalization. And you said you started to have a crisis of something like a crisis of purpose, because it's like, okay, this is a process orientation. Where the heck is this process going? You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was all happening around the same time. Those years between 2012 and about 2015 or so were really critical for me. And after that is when I started my PhD work, because I finally had my burning question about what we're actually supposed to be doing in internationalization. But so in 2012, around the same time that I was having these sort of epiphanies through my friendship and the great patience of my Indigenous colleagues, Canada released their international education strategy. That document is very much, grows out of the only sort of national body that really speaks to international education, which is foreign affairs, global affairs now. And the document has been criticized for being grounded only in economic rationales for international education. It's been critiqued for being colonizing, for showing Canada's privilege, for being Canada-centric, and Canadian government-centric and Canadian finances-centric. By Rupert Trillo-Kekar actually did a critical discourse analysis. So there was no sense within that document at all about decolonizing, deconstructing, making the institutions more hospitable to international students. Like there's nothing like that in it. And then shortly thereafter, we see the TRC, in the same government that published the Global Affairs document, also published the Truth and Reconciliation and the Calls to Action. And I couldn't reconcile that in my mind. How can we both say it's what we're doing inside Canada is wrong, but we can go ahead and do all those things outside of Canada?
Well, thoughts, Corey?
I mean, I think that's part of the challenge that we have in our society, even as society. And don't get me wrong, I'm a very proud Canadian. I'm grateful to be Canadian. I've traveled the world. There's no other country I'd rather be discriminated in than Canada. So it's important to recognize that that's one of the challenges. We have a beautiful Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We have various other legislation, but they don't often reconcile with the federal policies and directions that are given, nor do they make their way down to day-to-day on the ground changes, which is very challenging, right? And in some ways very disheartening. But I do firmly believe that when people know better, they do better. So it's about education. It's about individual responsibility that each and every one of us has. It's a great privilege to be in the academy, particularly as we've seen with many of our other areas. We've survived COVID in the sense that, you know, at least at our institution, people have not lost their jobs and are not in fear of losing their jobs. But it's a great responsibility to, in many ways, educate the next generation, the next generation of leaders, and that education for all must be whole and complete, and authentic, and contain truth telling, and with, you know, a challenge to action, your reconciliation to move, you know, create a better society, really.
Yeah. I'm wondering right now, is there work right now that you're seeing in this area, in this field, that's supportive of some of the perspectives that both of you are sharing? You know, we're not 9 years ago anymore. Like, some things are glacially moving slowly, but some things are shifting. And I'm wondering if you're seeing anything that's supportive of the perspective you're bringing, or what you're trying to accomplish through your work or through your networks of colleagues that do this work. And are there any places of collaboration or creation that are happening in this field? And I'm wondering, can I start with Corey again, and then I'll come to Sonia?
Yeah, sure. I think there are, certainly in Vancouver, with the city of Vancouver, I work with them to create a First Peoples and Newcomers Guide, so that new immigrants, and including, of course, international students, can learn about Indigenous people. We have Indigenous awareness modules at BCIT that are currently being updated and will be translated into the top 10 most spoken languages of newcomers into Canada. You and I, of course, are working closer together with our and that project that we're doing, the Indigenous mobility project that we're working on. There's a law firm that is an immigration law firm in Vancouver that has approached us and asking us to support them. How can they help us bridge and connect Indigenous students with international students? And, you know, certainly once we can actually be back in person, I hope we're going to have many more opportunities where our elders can meet with international students, and the international students will also meet with our Indigenous students to help recognize and inspire them to know that we, even though we're from different countries, speak different languages, at the core, we're all humans, and in many ways have the same wants and needs and hopes and dreams. So yeah, I think there's a lot of pockets. There's certainly in the immigrant serving organizations in Vancouver, there's a lot of awareness increasing, which will spread to international students as well.
Yeah, I see that EJ has posted in the chat for people the links to some of the work that Corey was talking about, the work you did with Vancouver Immigration Partnerships for that was for the city, right? As well as our Indigenous services. Yeah, great. Thanks very much, EJ, for putting those in there. Sonia, would you like to contribute to this?
Yes. So internationalization, through its, you know, fairly brief history, it's not that old of a profession. We still haven't really come to a consensus about, you know, what is the end goal of internationalization. And I find when I look at indigenization, you can see clearly that there's an end goal. This is what we're changing for. And so I've really appreciated working closely with my Indigenous colleagues. We had actually one of our Indigenous women, she worked with the Indigenous office, and then we had a position available, and she's traveled a lot, you know, like Corey says, you know, and so she actually has a deep understanding of internationalization. And so she joined our office for a few years, until then she went back to the Indigenous office now at a higher position. And that was huge for us, having actually somebody who was Indigenous part of the international office. That was, I can see how much I learned and how much my staff learned just by her sort of quiet, calm presence and her questions that kind of would cut through everything. And, you know, she's not a chatty person, but when she speaks, everyone listens. That was, you know, if that is at all possible in any international offices of any of the people that I'm presenting to, that we're presenting to right now, I would say that that was really, really helpful to have somebody who brought that perspective to our office and to everything that we did and every conversation that we had at the lunch table about anything. That was so critical. But there's some other areas that I think that, you know, international students and Indigenous students can also learn from each other and support each other. They face similar, I guess, generic labels that tend to deny their own real identity. So I know, at least with international students, sometimes I feel that people, you know, at the institution or in the media or in the local community, they talk about international students as if they're this sort of one lump that are like a completely same identity. They're your internationals, which is a word that I very much object to. Whenever I hear it, I do correct people. International students don't consider themselves, like, there's not an identity of being an international student. It's a description of, you know, their current status being a student and being on a temporary resident permit. But, you know, they're a Kenyan student or they're an engineering student, right? They might identify with their chosen profession. It's really an oversimplification to call these students who come from so many different nations and so many different cultures international students, and it's sometimes used to, I think, obscure racism. So we had a situation here where a local media outlet reported on some vandalism that happened outside prayer space on our campus. And the media, instead of reporting this as Islamophobia, they just said this was vandalism that happened on campus in a location where international students are located. And it's like, well, international students are not located in prayer rooms. There's many international students that, you know, that aren't Muslim, and there's many Canadians that are Muslim. And so this was not an attack on international students. But there's that sort of conflation of and a lack of understanding that there's different cultures, there's different nations, and that we need to be learning and respecting all of them individually and learning from them what their identity is. And I think, and from my, you know, when I have conversations with my Indigenous colleagues, it seems like there's similar things going on with Indigenous students, that there's similar issues around identity and lack of, and sort of generically calling people just this sort of overall umbrella term instead of saying Coast Salish, you know, Inuit, you know, and I think that that's one thing that together we could work on, helping people to deal with this complexity, because people want to oversimplify things. That's normal, but it can end up being racism, obscuring racism, those kinds of things.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Corey?
About which part?
What Sonia was just saying, this simplifying people down to this is your status or this is your, and how we need to build out socialize in some way, educate and socialize something that is more complex than that.
Well, I think in some ways it's just a lazy way of being, and people do this to others all the time. They're very clear on their own characteristics and nature and value of their own groups that they belong to, but we don't extend that in some ways humanity to the others. And it's really important that we stop it, because that's indicative, of course, of racism and the systemic discrimination that we have in many of our institutions, that we have in our own persons and how we interact with the world. And you have to take the time to recognize that the differences between and amongst us. as either international students or as Indigenous people as well. There's incredible diversity. Even amongst I have 4 Indigenous kids, 3 girls and a boy, and they're all very different. Yes, they have the exact same genes, the same, they're all of that. But as we know, our own children are not the same. So why on earth would an entire group of people be exactly the same? And I think it's really important to start from the point of, I know they're different. I know not they're different, but I know that there are differences, and I'm going to seek to find those rather than looking for similarities to streamline your work, to streamline your approach. It's important to take the time just to simply get to know people as people, which we can do and should do, and have a responsibility, I think, to international students and Indigenous students that we bring into the academy, to really get to know who they are. And of course, you're going to find groups of students that have the same needs that the solutions are the same, but you can't start from the point of what is it that you need and how can I help you, rather than, oh, you're Indigenous, okay, here's the elder, right? There's just a different way of thinking about it and a different way of approaching it.
You know, earlier on, Sonia talked about, you know, internationalization of the curriculum, and this belief in internationalization, that's this process orientation. We're not achieving our goal. And I'm wondering, what's the goal these days? What is the goal? I think it's really, you know, I think one of the purposes of BCCIE pulling these conversations together is to say, oh my goodness, we used to think that these were noble goals 25 years ago, and then 15 years ago, and 50 years ago, you know, and Corey, you went to, you know, Pearson, and like, what's the noble goal? I used to work with someone, her name was Isabelle Giroux, and I think Sonia, you've met Isabelle perhaps, and she would talk about what is our noble work? What is that? What is the goal that we should be really striving to achieve? So where are we going with that, with the way of thinking that you're headed?
For me?
I'll ask Sonia first. Whoever wants to have a kick. I'll start with Sonia, but it was unscripted question here. I'm just trying to think about, so where are we?
So to me, the goal for internationalization is the development in our own youth, the Canadian youth that form up the dominant society, the majority in particular in my university, we have 70% of our students at Memorial are Newfoundlanders and Labradorians. And so it's helping those students to understand that there's different ways of being and knowing in the world. And that's not a message that internationalization has been able to get across. It's still very much about dollars. It is still very much about bringing in international students and helping to pay our bills. So what I have so appreciated about TRC calls to action and the indigenization that's being taken seriously by our post-secondary institutions is that learning is happening. That learning about there are other ways of knowing and being, and they're right here in Canada. And my hope and my goal is for people to understand, like, there's not only different ways of knowing and being amongst different peoples in Canada, but also in the entire world. So it's important for you to understand the Chinese worldview if you're going to live in this globalized world and be successful. It's also really important for you to learn the worldview of the Innu and the Inuit. That will also set you up to be a more well-rounded person, to be able to understand and engage with the world around you, no matter where you end up.
And so much of our education is focused on technos, right? On technique and fun. Yeah. So how do we have that balance? What your thoughts on this, Corey?
I mean, my thought on the noble goal is I think we should strive, if we're talking about in the academy, is to provide the students with the skills and abilities and the competencies that they're going to need to be successful in the life and the path that they choose, and to ensure that they're properly prepared. We're not going to have, I mean, we all know, if there's no jobs in a particular area, well, particularly at a polytechnic, if there's no jobs in a particular area, we can't run the program in good faith. You can't run that program, no matter how much students are willing to pay for it. So it's what are the skills and abilities that we need, and if we have a responsibility to, if we're talking about just international students, if you're taking their money, you have an extreme responsibility to ensure that they are successful in Canada, because as you know, many families, send that one kid abroad to break this cycle and to get them to Canada and to get to a country where they can, then support their family back home. We have an obligation to ensure that they have relevant, globally required skills to be able to do whatever jobs they want, and also at the same time support the whole student while the student is there. It's very challenging. Sometimes we're not as, we don't provide the English language support that's necessary for students in classrooms. I teach every now and then in a post-secondary classroom, and the particular institution has gone, in many ways, brought in so many international students that it's very challenging in the classroom because English is not a first language, and the level of English is so you have to change, and we're not doing service to these students because they're not able to express themselves in the language of instruction. I don't speak their languages, and I think we're setting some of them up to fail, and a huge risk, and it's extremely important. We also don't prepare them for, and again, this is broad generalization, right? But we don't prepare them for how school works in Canada. How when you write an essay, you can't just copy somebody's, you can't plagiarize. Or when you do an exam, it's not a team exercise, it's an individual exercise. So I don't think we do enough, a good enough job preparing the majority of international students. And I think if we did ground them in the place and space, support them holistically, we're going to have much greater success. And it does, yes, cost a bit more money and time up front, but we owe that to them to be able to do that.
That's such an important point, Corey. And to me, it gets back to the concept of showing hospitality to people that are from different nations that come into your space, right? That's the whole thing. If you're showing hospitality to someone, you're showing them how they can be successful. I read a book, I think it's in one of the resources here, by Rana Kuokkanen, who is Sami, and I have Sami family in my family tree. My
family.
parents were Sami, and they immigrated to Canada. And so there's just something about her book called Reshaping the University, The Logic of the Gift. And she talks about the Sami approach to hospitality. And I took so much from that book when I applied it to internationalization. It was just devastating in a lot of ways to see how that isn't really part of how universities talk or think. We're starting to maybe starting to talk and think that way about Indigenous students, and that's really important. But we need to be thinking about how our campuses can be more hospitable to those of other nations, and no matter what nation they're from.
So we're transitioning here. I can hear that what we're talking about here, we're starting to investigate, and I'd like to spend, we have time. This is awesome. We have some time here to talk a little bit about, or to talk quite a bit about, what are the things that we need to do, and what can you suggest for us going forward in the work that we do? And I'm wondering, can we start with Sonia this time? just as a, maybe if you could talk a little bit about things that you're doing, the work that you see needs to be done, or work that you see other organizations are doing, about what do we need to do to go forward?
I mean, first, I think it has to start with each person, because you can't really do, you can't really accomplish anything unless you really look deeply into the mirror. And I think those, and you only can get that by having relationships with people who are willing to show you your face in the mirror and not be shy about it, because it is important. So I think starting with questioning yourself, starting with allowing other trusted colleagues that you've built relationships with to question you and what you're doing, and becoming comfortable with discomfort. As someone who, despite having Sami heritage, I did grow up as a settler. My family settled in Canada, and there is a huge vacuum in my knowledge or understanding of even my own heritage, let alone Canadian Indigenous heritage. And I think it's important to state here that a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. And so you actually need to stop and one, Todd, you may know this about internationalists. We tend to be problem solvers, right? We see a problem and we want to solve it. That is who we are. We're always, students, we call them international student advisors, because what do? We give advice. As soon as someone has an issue, we want to find the solution. And I think it's putting that sort of solution-oriented problem solving like on hold for a bit and not leaping at things. We in my office were very keen to support indigenization for all the reasons that I've said. And we launched forward with the support of our Indigenous office, but on an Indigenous mobility program with colleagues overseas. But what we didn't really realize was that our timelines and our expectations we were doing the leading, and we weren't allowing the Indigenous office to be the leader on this. Like, we were saying, okay, well, if we want to have people in by September, then we're going to have to sign this MOU by then, and we're going to have to do this, and we're going to have to do this, right? And so we were like colonizing the process of Indigenous mobility, and we got called on it, and it was a really hard conversation. But I so admire my Indigenous colleagues that stopped us in our tracks and said, no, we lead on this, not you. You're here to support, and you need to take that from us. And I was like, okay, another epiphany. But those are hard lessons to learn, right? Because in so much of our life, we're expected to take that initiative to get that thing going, and we're called on it if we don't, right? It's like, well, why is that taking so long? So it's finding it within ourselves to just stop, listen, learn, that the relationships are the only thing that matter. The deadlines and all those things, they'll come, things will happen when they happen. But what's most important is those relationships, and understanding that it's the Indigenous offices and the Indigenous peoples at the university that need to be the leads on this, and let us know how we can help.
So Corey, your thoughts about what are your suggestions and maybe things that you're doing, but also things that you're noticing being done maybe in other contexts, or things that are being not done yet, that would help us move forward in, I gotta say it again, reconciliation, and how we are working with this tension, but also the potential for collaboration between internationalization, indigenization, etc.
Well, I think as Sonia said, it takes courage to do this work. We have to overcome our courage. We have to overcome our fear to do this work. People are afraid to make mistakes. People are afraid to do it wrong and get it wrong, but you're going to make mistakes. We all make mistakes. and it's how you handle those mistakes. So being courageous, and one of the ways I help people try to put it in perspective is how hard do you think it is for an Indigenous student to come into the academy? Think of the barriers and hurdles and the courage they had to have to actually walk through that door. Even myself, even though it was predestined that my sister and I and my brothers were going to go to post-secondary, because both of our parents, the privilege I have, both of my parents have university degrees. There was no choice in my family but to go to university, or we knew how much rent was and what our responsibilities were if we didn't go to university. So even though being completely and fully prepared, it's still a challenging place to be, particularly if you're the only Indigenous person in a classroom. If your culture is being put up there as an example in an anthropology or sociology class and it's wrong, and you challenge the doctor, whoever it is, it's still a very challenging place to be. So, and I was fully prepared academically, emotionally, so all of that stuff. So I found, so it's important to put your fear into context. And also, if you make a mistake, apologize and ask, what can I do better? But it's about going from connecting. We're too much in our heads in institutions and too much in this mindset but what we need to do is connect our head to our heart, and then with our hands to give. And we need to listen way more than we speak. And you've all heard that elders say, we have 2 ears for a reason and 1 mouth. So it's really important to do that. And as Sonia acknowledged, even though it was challenging to be called on going ahead, it's important to recognize that. And that's where that building of relationships in an authentic and engaged way, and recognizing that it's not going to fit normally what the academy would like to see or the time frame, but allowing that to happen is really important. And the reality is when people know better, they do better. When they work together, things are much more efficient and effective. And more people, the ripple effects are huge when you do that. And we need to get rid of our silos. We've seen that with COVID, whether it's between and amongst institution, between and amongst, Canada would have no vaccines, but for other countries giving it to us, right? So we are all so intricately connected that we might as well leverage leverage our resources and use them effectively and efficiently together. And the same with indigenization. You can't lead indigenization, but you can be supportive of it. And the effects are, for example, at BCIT, we have our Indigenous Wellness Toolkit.
Yeah.
It is a toolkit that everybody can benefit from and everybody can use. It's not as though you have to do X for Indigenous people and Y for this group of people, because they're recognize those common threads. That's how it manifests, or how it's actually put into action. That's different for the most part. Everybody wants to feel they belong. Everybody needs to have somebody on their team, so those are commonalities. But and recognizing that, and being humble is another one in the academy. It's hard for a lot of academics to who are used to being right. That's not what it's about. So
Yeah, I'm an expert, right? That expert, the trap of being an expert.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, you said something, we're too much in our heads.
Well,
And
yeah. Well,
talk about that a little.
Well, I think we forget the humanity in our students and the needs of our students and our own needs. So so I noticed a comment in the question and answers about words and terminology. That's one thing, like, we often don't engage in, and as Sonia mentioned, that we have to have the uncomfortable conversations. We can't, but usually what we do is the conversation stops or stalls because we haven't agreed on the appropriate terminology that's acceptable to everybody in the group. And an example I have is when I gave a lecture to a entire faculty at a particular university. And for the first because I timed it, because I'm used to this now, the first 18 minutes was spent on and note that there were no Indigenous people, and nobody identified as Indigenous. And I know there was no Indigenous people in that group. There's probably about 32 people. And I use the term Indian because I still have a card in my wallet that certifies that I'm a status Indian under a particular section of the Indian Act. And I use the term Indian in terms of the Indian Act. I'm not going to change it and sanitize it and call it the Indigenous Act, which is what this particular professor took offense to. So we spent 18 minutes talking about the term Indian and how he was offended by it. So finally at 18 minutes, I said, you know what? I don't want to talk, I'm not going to talk about this anymore. I'm the only Indian in this Zoom call. And this is 18 minutes that we talked about you being comfortable with the issues that have affected my family since contact. And it's called the Indian Act. And it could have been 18 minutes that we spent on talking about the harms that the Indian Act has done and how the legacy still continues to a day and affects students in the academy today. So that's what I mean by being too much in our head. We have this idea and wanting to be politically correct and using the appropriate terms. The academies agreed that settler is the politically correct term. I find the term very offensive. So I have a choice to make. Every time I hear the word settler, I can refuse to participate in the conversation, or I can just go on ahead and make my point and try to bridge gaps. So that's what we spend too much time setting the parameters, determining the pedagogy, doing all of these things that you're trained to do in your PhDs and in how to move up the ranks at the universities. Then just looking at, okay, well, how do I relate or how do I build an authentic relationship and have meaningful engagement between and amongst ourselves, not only as faculty and as staff at universities, but with actual students. How do we break down, students are people. We were students once as well. So how do we meet the needs of students and, leave our ego at the door, go forth with courage, and be willing to make some mistakes.
Wow. Open to mistakes, humble and courageous. That's a hard one. Sonia, do you want to add to that? I was asking, you can react to whatever you want, but I was originally asking about, we're so much in our heads in the academy.
Yeah, so international educators aren't really known for their activism. They're known for being nice. They're known for being kind to international students, but they're not known for activism. And to me, and that's part of what my dissertation was looking at is, does the university want an activist in their international lead? And my conclusion was no, that they don't. But I don't see that I can really support or influence international students to be able to find their voice in Canada, that find a way to express their and find a forum to express themselves, unless I think I can be an activist myself. So the students I'm the one convening them for the international panels. So who is responsible then if the international students are sitting there and saying, yes, it's okay in my classes, I'm having an okay experience, people are nice, and and if that's all that they're saying, if they're not really able to feel comfortable or confident to share really frank observations and experiences, then that's my fault, right? Because I haven't set it up that way. And that's, I think, one area that I'm looking to tackle. And again, where do I look in the institution to find out how to be that? There's really no other place except for in the Indigenous office. The other offices in the university, whether they're academic units or whether it's the, the career office or the, the writing center, the whatever, they don't have that call to be transformational, but we do, supposedly in the IHE field, we do talk about transformation.
Yeah.
Often though, it ends up just being transformation by default. The institution suddenly, from being completely white, becomes more diverse. because we brought in a bunch more international students. And so now we've transformed because we have students from all over the place. But that, to me, isn't transformation. I have a much different idea of what transformation is. And that knowledge and understanding of what transformation is and should be comes to me from reading literature around indigenization, but not from reading literature around internationalization. And so that's where I'm kind of stuck, I think, is, why aren't we in internationalization writing and researching and setting ourselves and grounding ourselves in values that are the values of hospitality, respecting other ways of knowing. And I don't have an answer, but I know that we're, for a field that's probably 40 years old, we're quite far behind in really grounding in anything else but an economic rationale.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Q&A. There are some folks, and I'll encourage folks to post questions in the Q&A, and I would ask people if you could make sure that you have attached your name. There's a couple of anonymous ones in there, and I would appreciate if we could identify ourselves when we ask questions. Aisha has asked a question, and I want to pick up on what you were just talking about, Sonia, here, is can you think of, you looked at internationalization of the curriculum, etc. What are some good examples or some promising examples or direction that you're seeing right now in internationalizing the curriculum?
There's one person that's the only person that I've really seen that has written anything that really resonates with me is in this book here called The Future Agenda of International Education. You can see it.
Mm-hmm.
There's a chapter in there by someone from the US, McAllister Grande is Brian McAllister Grande. And he is the only person really that I've ever seen that talks about looking deeply at the foundations of the knowledge, the Western knowledge that we're, and he's not writing, he's from the States and from, not writing necessarily, it doesn't mention indigenization, but just talks only about internationalization. And so he talks about internationalization of curriculum as being something that openly examines the foundation of the knowledge that you're teaching your students, and then bringing in other international perspectives, which could also be other Indigenous perspectives, right? Mm-hmm. And I really, I go back to that chapter that he wrote in that book all the time when I'm doing presentations on internationalization of curriculum, because I think that's what it is, right? It's looking at our foundations and understanding how they're centered on just one particular way of knowing and understanding the world.
Good. Yeah, and would you, I know that you supplied a reading list that will be posted later. Is that in the reading list that?
Yes, I believe it is. I think the book is. I have a chapter in there too. The chapter that I have in there is on indigenization and internationalization. But amongst the other chapters, I came across this other one unexpectedly and found it really useful for trying to develop a theory for internationalization.
We talking about another question we talked about is truth and reconciliation. Sandra has written something in here, and there's this important dynamic, this balance and this dynamic between truth and reconciliation. And Sandra's perception is that, her question is that we're skipping over the truth and to get to some preconceived actions that continue to be steeped in colonization. And I'm wondering, I'll ask Corey first and then Sonia, would you like to respond to that? Because I think this is core to what we're talking about today.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, people gravitate to what's comfortable. It's they've been able to do it. The status quo has been able to do that since, again, beginning of contact. Those with power are vested in maintaining the status quo. Anything that upsets that is often something that they don't have the courage to address. But the reality is that we need people to start understanding and recognizing the truth and help promote that truth. So on an individual level, I think it's the responsibility of every single Canadian to start learning the truth. You didn't learn it in school unless you just graduated from high school recently, at least in British Columbia. And of course, we saw in Ontario the wonderfully crafted, brilliant Indigenous additions to the curriculum. When the current government got in, they're now not put into the curriculum. So you're not going to get it. So there is a responsibility for everyone to learn about Indigenous people and learn that truth and sit with that truth. And then ask yourself, what are you going to do? So as an individual and as part of a family, and when you see myth information put out there, it's important that you counter that. And then as well in the academy, if it should be nothing about us without us. You can't go ahead and plan a program with Indigenous people involved without actually having the Indigenous voice there and
Right.
building those connections. And I don't know if you've seen, but SSHRC and NSERC came out with new guidelines. You should not be applying for NSERC or SSHRC grants with an Indigenous thing without the Indigenous person being a full participant in the process, being labeled and identified on the publication, being paid to be part of it. Like, we have to stop doing those types of things. So yes, it has to be grounded in truth. And yes, and there's reasons, part of it too. And when you see somebody that perhaps avoids the truth, is ask yourself why. What is the reason and what is the advantage that they're getting by doing that? And how can I dismantle that? How can I challenge that? How can I expose that?
We're both colleagues at BCIT, and the number of people that have come to me and said, I have Corey saying not about us without us ringing in my ear every day. So if anything, at minimum,
Yeah.
at minimum. And there's someone else has asked a little bit about when we're onboarding and bringing in students and thinking about language of instruction, and we've been talking about the medium of instruction being English for a long time. What is our current view on languages? We're sort of towards the end of our session here, and please feel free to touch on that. And I would like to, in a post-COVID world, I'd like to ask, what do we see as, what's something that you would like to initiate or see, Sonia, and what would you like to see, Corey, in our post-COVID world, whenever the heck that is? But would you like to talk a little bit about language of instruction, Sonia, briefly, and then we'll talk about that post.
I mean, that's a really key piece, because the language of instruction is also the culture of the learning. So if you study in French, the things that you learn and the way that you learn even to read a text, like I went to French school because I grew up in Quebec, and the way that we read in Quebec, the way that we would read a novel and look at each verb tense very carefully and why that verb tense was chosen, it teaches you something about the culture. And in English, you read more for meaning. In French, at least at that time, the style was you read more, the explication de texte. You read very deeply and you understand each of the word choices. So, those just simple differences help you to understand that there is a different way of looking at the world. So if you're only learning about the world through the English language, then you are really not, then you're learning it through a very filtered way, because any of you that speak other languages, that sometimes there's a perfect word in that other language that we just don't have, right? It expresses a feeling, or it expresses a concept or a term that we don't have. So when we, have our English proficiency standards and all that, that's again, very colonial. It's saying that, you don't have the English, you might be brilliant, but sorry, unless you can pass the IELTS, you're not welcome here. And, I have a real problem with the way that English is really taking over the language of research. And because it's never only the language. You know, Quebec is right. I mean, I grew up in Quebec, so I think I have that very much down pat that I listened to when I was growing up and went through the referendums. Like, it's not just about the language, but if you lose the language, you lose the culture, the way of expressing, the way of being. And so language is so critical. The language that my great grandfather spoke, there's only 3 speakers left in the world. So that language has pretty much disappeared. It didn't come down to me. It didn't, carry on, even in Sweden. And that's tragic, because there's a whole level of cultural understanding of their place that is disappeared now.
So Corey, get last word. You can choose the post-COVID question, or you can respond to what.
Well, I think post-COVID, I hope that all of us worldwide, not just in Canada, but all of us remember the inequities that COVID highlighted.
Right.
And that we do not forget that, and we don't go back to the same old status quo, and that people truly ask themselves, what can I do to make this world a better place? What can I do daily? I mean, yes, very few of us are going to make global change on become the world person of the year. That's not going to happen for most of us, but all of us have, so look at all the places and spaces that you occupy and ask yourself, how can I make a difference? How are all voices represent? We haven't even achieved parity yet for women in Canada. So, I mean, we're so far behind for other groups, but it's going to require all of us to look at the places and spaces we occupy. Who is not so much who is there, who isn't there,
Right.
and what is my responsibility, and what can you do to elevate and bring others into those rooms and knock down some of those barriers, and have the courage to do it. The reality is we're academics, so we all know research. There's massive research that shows the more diverse a group, or a board, or whatever kind of group or organization, the more successful and innovative that group is. Even just in the studies, there's more people named David who are CEOs in the United States than women who are CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. But the Fortune 500 companies that have seen significant growth have 3 women on their board. So if we have that much, and don't even get me started about whether growth is the right measure of success, because I clearly don't think it is, but we live in that society at the moment. Imagine if you added brown, Black, Indigenous voices to those tables, the innovation and creativity that can happen. And please don't ever say, well, we've always done it this way. We've always done a lot of things certain ways, and it's just, do not ever say that again. It's just ridiculous to think that way.
And I think you touch on something. It's not just about the presence of people who are different, it's how they engage one another. Yeah. And I think earlier when we talked about the humility, and we talk about courage, and to be able to be that kind of person at that kind of a table, that's the kind of curriculum that we can create. That's the kind of experience we can create. The institutions and the society, that we can create. If we have that courage, both of you have spoken about the importance of looking inside, looking at ourselves, sitting in that. And I just want to say, thank you so much to both of you for sharing that, because both of you clearly have spent your lives grappling with that. And thank you for sharing your wisdom and your experience and your knowledge and those deeper parts of yourself with everybody out here today. And I think what I'll do is I'll welcome back EJ Bryn to our session.
Thanks, Todd. Corey and Sonia, really what a wonderful and powerful conversation that you both had. Thank you for taking us on that journey today and sharing your insights and your thoughts, and also all the resources that you shared as well, which we will be sending out after the event as well. So there are a few announcements before we sign off. First, our next webinar is on May 25th. It's entitled Aligning Policy with Practice, International, Intercultural, and EDI. We're also going to be hosting an additional webinar, as I mentioned, on June 15th to kind of wrap up and open up new conversations, since this dialogue series is about continuing the conversation around these topics. So please stay tuned for that one. I do think the link was updated and placed in the chat box. We'll also send that out after the event. And finally, there are some other resources that we will be adding to that as well, including for some of you that know about the LII conference out in Kamloops, usually held at Thompson Rivers University. There will be one in 2022. And there are some publishing, some articles that were published from the last conference that was held that I think will be of interest and should be coming out, I think, at the end of this month or early next month. So we'll be sending those out, either a link to those either in the email after this event, or we'll make sure to include it in the next webinar. So with that being said, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Sonia and Corey and Todd. This was really a wonderful way to start the morning. And for me, really leaves me with lots of things to think about as we move forward. So thanks again, and see everybody next month.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Corey. It's great.